fact, it's quite a wide subject. And the reason that we have put it on the agenda today, and the reason why we've written a document, is because of the large layer of new comrades who have come into our ranks in the recent period, who have no real appreciation, perhaps, or knowledge of our roots. Now, this is not a history lesson as such. This session is about our heritage, the heritage that we defend and the heritage that we reject. Now, in 1933, in Germany, Hitler came to power, which was a catastrophe at that point. The German working class was probably the strongest working class in the world. And very quickly it was destroyed, and the road was paved for the Second World War. And the reason for this catastrophe was the criminal policies of the Stalinists, the theory of social fascism, which divided the German working class, paralyzed the working class. And Hitler could boast that he came to power without breaking a window pane. And in the aftermath, the Stalinist leaders said, well, after Hitler, our turn. They refused to recognize the defeat. It did not create a ripple, really, of opposition within the ranks of the Communist International. And as a consequence, in July 1933, Trotsky declared that the old Communist International was dead as far as the Proletarian Revolution was concerned. And that the task facing the working class now was the building of a new international. That the policy of reform of the Comintern, which had been in place since 1923, was now no longer valid, and therefore Trotsky put all his energies, his body and soul, in trying to establish and create the new Fourth International. In 1935, when Christian Rakovsky, the old oppositionist, capitulated under the pressures of Stalinism, Trotsky wrote in his diary, Rakovsky was virtually my last contact with the old revolutionary generation. After his capitulation, there is nobody left. Nobody remains. I am engaged now in the most important work of my life. More important than 1917, more important than the period of the Civil War or any other period. There is no arrogance in this claim at all. Fate armed me with the necessary experience. There is no one except me to carry out the mission of arming a new generation with the revolutionary method over the heads of the leaders of the Second and Third International. And he concluded, I need at least about 5 more years of uninterrupted work to ensure the succession. Unfortunately, as we know, Trotsky only had 5 more years to live before his assassination. But these years were not uninterrupted as he had hoped. And yet by September 1938, the Fourth International was finally founded. Given Trotsky's enormous political authority, he was in reality the Fourth International. He embodied the Fourth International. Looking back, we can see that the construction of this international was undertaken in the most difficult of circumstances. We see the defeats and the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, the defeat of the factory occupations in France, the defeat in Spain, the Spanish Revolution, the one-sided civil war in Russia, and the Purge trials, murdering all the companions of Lenin. You can see the movement was born in a period of reaction and enormous persecution of the Trotskyist movement. And when we talk about persecution, we really mean it. In Russia, the left opposition was physically exterminated. They were arrested, they were sacked, and they were sent to the gulags in order to be murdered. Trotsky's son, his eldest son, Sergei, was shot by Stalin in the summer of 1937. In the same month, Erwin Wolf, a leading member, was murdered. In September 1937, Ignace Reiss was assassinated in Switzerland. Leon Sedov was murdered in February 1938. And Rudolf Clement, who was the secretary of the Fourth International, was assassinated in July 1938. and they found his headless corpse. They cut his head off, his arms off, and his legs off, and dumped them in the Seine. That was the terror that the Trotskyist movement faced, which eventually took the life of Trotsky in August 1940. We know that in the early 1930s, when Trotsky raised the banner of the international left opposition, all sorts of people came to this banner for different reasons, mostly because they hated Stalin. They knew what they were against, but they did not understand what Trotsky was fighting for, the genuine traditions of Bolshevism. And therefore, during the 1930s, if you read Trotsky's writings, he wages a war of clarification against those sectarians, the ultra-lefts, all those accidental elements who had drifted into his orbit. And therefore, he had to fight to cleanse the movement. He also pointed out many times that the older generation was finished. The older generation was worn out, was demoralized. And what was required was the winning and education of new cadres that would form the basis of the new revolutionary wave. If you look back at the 1930s, you can say there were some exceptions, but generally the human material that Trotsky had to work with was extremely limited. They had been affected by the period. In his book, In Defense of Marxism, Trotsky explained, a considerable proportion of the membership of the American section, as well as our entire Young International, came to us either from the Comintern or from the Second International. These are bad schools, he said. Wide circles of the party lack a sound theoretical education. And this applied not only to the rank and file, but also some of the leading elements in the movement. They were very good at repeating phrases, very good at quoting texts of Marx, of Lenin, and so on. But they lacked an understanding of the Marxist method of dialectical materialism. If you read their writings, they're very rigid and they're very mechanical in their outlook. And Trotsky was quite alarmed by this situation. In fact, when he first arrived in Mexico, he met with two leaders of the American SWP, and the first thing he raised with them was the need to have a campaign within the movement for dialectical materialism. The first thing. And it was this weakness, this failing to understand the method of Marxism, the method of Trotsky, that is the key to understanding the degeneration of the Fourth International. In fact, this failure was to destroy the movement. In 1938, when Trotsky outlined a very bold perspective. The coming World War would transform the entire world. He said it would provoke a revolutionary wave. It would decide the fate of the Soviet Union. Either the Stalinist regime would be overthrown by political revolution, or it would be overthrown by imperialist intervention. He predicted that within 10 years, not one stone upon another would be left of the old organizations, and that the Fourth International would be the dominant force on the planet. Of course, as we know, this was a perspective. It was a prognosis. It was certainly not a blueprint. In fact, the actual course of events is far more complicated than even the best prognosis. And in relation to the war, it's even more complex. It's the most complex of equations. And Trotsky explained this. He said, it would be a vain task to attempt at this time to predict the course of the war and the fate of its various participants. Only the war itself will decide the destiny of the war. And as we know, the course of the war turned out differently to what Trotsky had envisaged. Yes, it's true, there was a mass revolutionary wave following the war. That's true. It's correct. But the way in which the war unfolded didn't weaken Stalinism, but strengthened Stalinism for a whole epoch. And the perspectives of Trotsky were falsified. But it's not Trotsky's perspectives that was only falsified. All the participants' perspectives were falsified. As you know, in August 1939, Stalin entered a pact with Hitler. In June 1941, when Hitler attacked, he refused to defend the country. He disappeared, stating all that Lenin has built is ended. He allowed Hitler's armies to sweep through Russia right up to Leningrad. Churchill and Roosevelt believed, because they could see that the war in Europe was turning out to be a struggle between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. They believed that those forces would mutually exhaust one another, and they, the imperialists, could step in and take the loot. But this didn't happen. The idea put forward by Trotsky in The Revolution Betrayed was that the imperialist troops carried in their backpacks would be cheap commodities. But Hitler's armies didn't bring cheap commodities. They brought the firing squad, the concentration camp. They brought hell to the Soviet Union. And the masses fought against that barbaric reaction of facing them. And together with the planned economy, they were able to turn the tide. And they swept Hitler's armies all the way back to Berlin. Of course, this transformed the entire world situation. Of course, if Trotsky had lived at that time, he would have seen what was happening and adjusted the perspective he had in 1938. But Trotsky had died in 1940. And then the leaders of the Fourth International, James Cannon, Pablo, Mandel, Pierre Frank, they all refused to recognize the changed situation. They all refused to see reality. Instead, they clung firmly to the 1938 perspective. For them, nothing had changed. And of course, this had profound consequences for the movement. Without Trotsky's guidance, these leaders of the Fourth International, at the first test, collapsed. And the only group in the world who understood what was happening in the post-war period, the immediate post-war period, was the leaders of the Workers' International League and the Revolutionary Communist Party in Britain. Of all, the key theoretician of these parties, Comrade Ted Grant. Now, I don't have time to go into a history of British Trotskyism to any detail. I want you to say that the formation of the Workers' International League in December 1937 was a turning of British Trotskyism. The original Trotskyist group emerged in 1933, the Balham Group. A small group, about a dozen people who were expelled from the Communist Party for advocating a united front in Germany, as a matter of fact. But this group, as all the groups in the 1930s in Britain, were completely infected with a small circle mentality. As with most of the groups, they were very sectarian, very formalistic, and as Ted said, they were very bohemian in their ways. In fact, he used to say about the old group, you know, the way they dressed was enough, with their beards, no apologies to beards, with their beards, with their sandals. I've changed my shoes, noted. And their cloaks, man. It's like Halloween. What a petty bourgeois rabble in reality, useless people. And they provoked the split, actually, in 1937, late 37, where Ted Grant and 7 other comrades walked out of this old organization. And these brave eight comrades broke with the old traditions. And they were most notably Ted Grant, Ralph Lee, who had recruited Ted in South Africa, and Jock Haston, an ex-member of the Communist Party. It also contained a man called Jerry Healey, who, as you anticipate, played an extremely pernicious role later on. Although it's quite humorous, some of the episodes. Ted used to tell the tales of British Trotskyism, and how Jock Haston was selling the paper in London in Marble Arch, and he was approached by this short, stocky guy whose name was Jerry Healey, who was a Stalinist. And of course, they had quite an argument. And Healey took a swing at Haston. But Haston was an ex-sailor, and he was a very tall man. Howard Healey, and the great British tradition of peaceful coexistence was expressed in the fact that Haston took Healey to a tea house. I don't know how many cups of tea they drank, and recruited him to Trotskyism. Biggest mistake he ever made. Anyway, this pioneering group of 8 comrades were determined to turn their backs on the old groups, the old sectarian groups, look to the fresh layers, the youth. Ralph Lee was quite an ingenious kind of guy. He found an old printing press which was broken and repaired it. And they immediately began to produce a magazine called Workers' International News, the WIN. Within a few months, they produced the pamphlet, The Lessons of Spain by Leon Trotsky, with an introduction by Ted and Ralph. They sent it to Trotsky together with copies of their publication. And Trotsky wrote back a letter admiring this excellent introduction and admiring the fact that they got a printing press. They were serious about building something. As perhaps the communists are aware, that letter went missing for decades. It was deliberately suppressed by the leaders of the American but by accident came into our possession, I don't know how many years ago, was it about 5 years ago? Anyway, something like that. And we were over the moon. Every time Ted would speak about the history of British thought, he always mentioned with pride this letter that Trotsky had sent. I was on a bit of a mission to try and find it, I know that. I went to Healey's archive, went to Harvard, see if we could find in Trotsky's archive, nothing in there. But this was an extremely important letter. Alan says it's our birthright. It's our birth certificate. And he's right. It's the only letter, it's the only written thing of Trotsky about the Workers' International League ever written. Nothing else. A compliment about the work they were doing. By the summer of 1938, this young group had grown from 8 to 30 comrades. They were doing work in the Labour Party, particularly the youth section of the Labour Party, and recruited from it. But by the summer, there were 4 Trotskyist groups in Britain at that time. You had, obviously, the Will, the Revolutionary Socialist Party in Edinburgh, the militant group in the Labour Party, and also the Marxist group, CLR James and Company. And James, obviously in September, the Congress, of the founding Congress, was to take place of the Fourth International. So James Cannon, who was the leader of the American SWP, came over to Britain to try and fuse these 4 groups into one, unify them before the founding Congress. The only problem was that these groups had different traditions, different perspectives, different methods, different orientation. But Cannon wasn't really concerned about that. He just wanted one group and get together, you know. And our position, Ted's position and the communist position was, look, we're in favor of unity, but on the right basis, on a correct principle basis. And that means an agreement on perspectives, an agreement on work, on orientation. So they did not agree with unifying with these other groups on that basis, without that. But they did agree to attend what was called the Unity Conference in August 1938 in London. There was no real discussion that took place. Some talk about the transitional program, but nothing else. And each of the groups had 20 minutes to make up their mind and sign the document. Ralph Lee described it as a bedroom farce, a French bedroom farce. People were coming in through one door, going out the other door, coming in through that door. It was just a bedroom farce. Anyway, the other groups agreed to unite. The Will remained outside. The Will were told, however, they could send a representative to the founding Congress if they wished. Unfortunately, they didn't have the resources to send anybody. So at the conference, all the delegates were told that the British section, the new British section, called the Revolutionary Socialist League, was to be recognized as the official section. And despite the fact that the Will sent a letter asking for a sympathetic affiliation, Cannon got up and used the occasion to slander the Will as splitters and only interested in their personal position. As a result, their request was denied, obviously. Cannon wrote a letter to Trotsky reporting the Congress and also attacking the Will. But Trotsky did not respond to this attack, didn't comment on the attack. It was quite clear that Trotsky wanted to wait and see how the group developed before giving his opinion. And as the comrades predicted at the time, this new section of the RSL would begin to split because of the false way in which they were united. And true enough, within a week, Glasgow and Edinburgh walked out. I think the same was with CLR James, although he was then taken to America. Then the whole thing started to come apart. But by this time, you're talking about not long now before the Second World War breaks out in September 1939. The will regard themselves as the illegitimate son of the Fourth International. And they just continued to work away to build their organization. By the time of the Second World War, they had 100 comrades. And by this time, Trotsky had argued for a new policy in face of the war. He called for a change in tactics, which became known as the Proletarian military policy. That they weren't going to simply repeat what was repeated in the First World War, which was aimed at the cadres, in consolidating the cadres against chauvinism. They were aiming at a far broader audience, and although they opposed, obviously, the imperialist war, they took into consideration the defensive moods in the working class itself. They said, in relation to Britain, they were in favor of a war against Hitler, no problem. But it should be under the control of the working class, not the Roosevelts and the Churchills and so on, which will always capitulated to Hitler in the past. In other words, there'd be no trust in the bourgeoisie. And the Workers' International League comrades and Ted Grant embraced this policy completely. The official section in Britain, the RSL, rejected the policy. In fact, they were so emphatic, they made it a condition of membership. You had to reject the military policy. They repudiated the International Manifesto of 1940 and even refused to print the transitional program. But it must be said that this opposition against the proletarian military policy wasn't confined to Britain, but affected most of the European parties, the French and the Belgium in particular, but also the international leadership. The European leadership were against it. Of course, the RSL was imbued also with pacifism. They had illusions, ultra-leftism and also pacifism. In Britain, in 1940, when we were facing invasion of Hitler, they argued, better the defeat of our own ruling class than the enemy. Our main enemy is at home, which didn't go down too well in the working class, obviously. But the point is, they didn't really engage with the working class. They also continued the policy of entrism in the Labour Party during the war, when there was no life in the Labour Party whatsoever, and the youth had all been conscripted. Whereas the will under the leadership of Ted Grant employed extremely flexible tactics. They immediately turned from entism to open work, independent work. And by 1941, they changed the name of their paper, which was called Youth for Socialism, to Socialist Appeal. And of course, the invasion of the Soviet Union by Hitler in June 1941 was also a turning point, where the communist parties changed their position against the war to one of support for the imperialist war. They became the most fervent strikebreakers and support for the bourgeois coalition government. Again, this provided the will with a great opportunity to move to the left, and they engaged in all the strikes that were breaking out, they were involved in. And they built up their union base, their working class base. By 1943, they had 300 members by 1943. They were doing successful work in the armed forces. The British government was forced to organize what they call soldiers' parliaments. And our comrades intervened in these parliaments and won leading positions, the speaker, the chair, all sorts of positions on the basis of our program. There was an extreme radicalization in the armed forces at that time. Ted made a speech in 1943 welcoming, he said, I welcome the 8th Army, the communists in the 8th Army, because it's our army, he said, our army. And what he meant by that is the troops in that army were sending letters. We were getting reports. They were radicalized. They were going to come back with Britain with arms. In fact, Ted was attacked for that by the leaders of the American for chauvinism. Oh, how can you welcome a bourgeois army? This sort of stuff. Not understanding the processes taking place in the ranks. They were doing model work. Frank Ward, who was a leader of the Will, was in the RAF. His work was so successful that they gave him an honorary discharge. They kicked him out with honors. Just to get rid of him. So I would say the Will was applying the policy of the military policy in a classic way. Probably the best in the world from that point of view, because the European sections were finished. Hitler had occupied the whole of Europe. By 1940, the official section, the RSL, had now grown from 170 members in 1938 to 23. They'd fallen to pieces. And within this 23, there were 3 factions. It's true. And of course, they were an embarrassment. Of course, Cannon in America could see this thinking, oh my God, what fine mess have we got me into here? So they attempted to push this group to a fuse with the Will. They try and fuse these factions together to have a conference to agree to link with the Will. It was a farce. And a new conference was called in March 1944, a unity conference. It was a Will takeover, which created the Revolutionary Communist Party in Britain. It had about 500 members, and obviously it had taken that name in order to appeal to the ranks of the Communist Party, which was obviously engaged in pro-war work. This was a great start. This was a promising start. But there was a problem, of course. And the problem was that Cannon, seen as the leader, because the international headquarters had now been transferred from Europe to New York during the war. And Cannon had carried a grudge against the leaders of the Will, given their opposition to the fusion in 1938. And he began to organize a faction inside the new party around the figure of Jerry Healey, who had been expelled several times in the previous years. I think the last time was in 1943, where he got up in the Central Committee and said, I'm leaving to join the ILP. And foolishly, the communists took it back every time. Well, he's got organizational ability and talent, and they brought him back. But this was a kind of conspiracy, if you want to put it that. This was a thing going behind the backs of the membership. It was also involving the new International Secretariat, which was now being reformed in Paris. With a new secretary, Pablo, and his sidekicks, Mandel and Pierre Frank. We should know that Ted himself had a profound knowledge of Marxism. He'd built up a profound knowledge of Marxism. He was an extensive reader. If you can get hands on anything, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, he read it and studied it. He mastered it. That was the idea. And that's why he became the leading theoretician. He was the editor of the Socialist Appeal, and he was the political secretary of the Will and the RCP. And he kept abreast of events. And he followed the events in Italy, for instance, in 1943, and the fall of Mussolini. And he could see that the bourgeois were resting upon the labor leaders, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party in particular, to hold back the revolution. And by 1945, it became quite evident what was taking place here. There was a revolutionary wave which was being betrayed by the Stalinists in particular and the Reformists. To prop up capitalism, the Communist Party sent representatives into the governments in Italy and in France. And this revolutionary wave was betrayed. And in early 1945, Ted had written this brilliant article about the balance of forces in Europe and the likely perspectives. And he described it as a counter-revolution in a democratic form. And therefore, he said, we need a new perspective. We can't rely on the 38 perspective. It's not applicable. We need a new perspective and educate the cadres in this new perspective for the future. There's not going to be a radical crystallization of mass Trotskyist parties for the time being. The processes are going to be more protracted. Capitalism is being given a new breathing space. But of course, the leaders of the Fourth International refused to recognize this change and stuck to the old perspective, which went to absurd lengths, where Cannon, Ted said Cannon was probably the best of them, probably. Because at least James Cannon had a history. He was organizing the IWW, a leader of the left wing in the Socialist Party, and a leader of the Communist Party. He had a history. But he wasn't a theoretician. He was a propaganda. He said, anybody who said he was no, I'm an agitator, he said. Above all, his political training and his methods of work were born, really, in the degeneration of the Communist International. He was originally a supporter of Zinoviev. And Zinoviev, after 1923, played an absolute disastrous role in preparing the way for Stalinism by the maneuvers, the organizational maneuvers in the communist movement. So Cannon just clung to the old perspectives, denied everything. He wrote, Trotsky predicted the fate of the Soviet Union would be decided in the war. It would fall, in other words, but it didn't happen. Therefore, he said, the war isn't finished then. This is November 1945. We disagree with some people who carelessly think the war is over. The war is not, he says. You make a mistake, okay. But if you don't recognize from your mistake and then learn from your mistake, you're going to make more mistakes. And this was the theme. They said that there could be no democracy after the war. Bourgeois democracy was ruled out. All you could have was Bonapartism. You're all familiar with that? Yes, the only thing you could have was Franco-style military dictatorships. That's the quote. Of course, Ted Grant, as just pointed out, attacked Pierre Frank. All of them had this idea. In fact, when Frank went back from Britain, when he was interned into France, they were all trying to get underground because military dictatorship, we all got to go underground. And Ted had to remind Pierre Frank and the others, well, after the First World War, in Germany you had the Weimar Republic, which were unstable bourgeois democracies arising from the defeat of the revolution. But the Fourth International leaders, all they could talk about, war, there's going to be a new war, a third world war, there's going to be fascism, there's going to be world slump, you name it. This is the prognosis they had. But in the post-war period, things didn't work out like that. Bourgeois democracy was being established, of course. Bourgeois elections were taking place. In Britain, the Labour Party had a landslide victory, hardly Bonapartism. Then they said, well, there's going to be military dictatorship and there can be no economic recovery or stability. Of course, Ted Grant and the RCP countered these ideas, explaining, hang on a minute, there is a counter-revolution but in a democratic form, and you're going to have bourgeois democratic regimes established. There's not going to be a world war. The imperialists are on the retreat. You had the war weariness of the masses. It was ruled out. And that there's going to be a recovery. Why? Because the crisis facing countries was not a crisis of overproduction, but underproduction. But the leaders of the International insisted that the output could never rise higher than 1938 levels. When the RCP explained, with the facts and figures, that there was an incipient boom taking place, the leading theoretician of the Fourth International, the economist, again, Ernest Mandel, wrote articles laughing, ridiculing the position of the RCP, Because if you accept the boom is taking place in Britain, you have to accept the boom is taking place throughout Europe. That's impossible. So again, they just blindly, without any reference to the reality of the facts, try to impose on reality a perspective that was outdated in 1938. You know, the old idea, the productive forces are stagnant, wrote Trotsky in 1938, and therefore they will always be stagnant. Although even that is a caricature of what Trotsky said about the productive forces. In his writings on Whither France, for instance, I can probably quote it from memory. The principal productive forces are stagnant or semi-stagnant. Hey, hang on a minute here. Surely you've got to be stagnant or you've got to be semi-stagnant. You can't be both, surely. But clearly, Trotsky had the view, not a mechanical view, but understood that can be countries that can develop even in a depression. This was written in 1935, at the height of the depression. Anyway, it was similar. They had similar ideas to the Stalinists, really, in the third period. You know, this is the last crisis of capitalism. But as Ted Grant always explained, that the first law of dialectics is that truth is concrete. Truth is concrete. You must, in other words, start from the facts. Not what you like it to be, but what it is. But these so-called leaders of the Fourth International were really interested in their own prestige. You know? They believed they had inherited the mantle of Trotsky, therefore they knew all the answers. And they patently didn't. They were not up to the task. There's a quote from Trotsky, which is an interesting one. We have been witness to many surprises and will be for a long time to come. The ups and downs of history's routes are tortuous, to be sure. I have learnt to make do with the paths presented by the actual course of development. My starting point is actual development. He goes on, let us first establish the facts that are needed in order to understand what has happened. The opposition does not bind itself to any ready-made schemas. Its duty is to follow the actual development of the internal life of the country and the whole world situation. He concludes, not to distort, not to tendentiously select, not to embellish, not to sugarcoat, but honestly say what is. That is Trotsky's method. That is the method of Marxism. And that was the method that Ted Grant used to understand the changed nature of the situation. After the war, the whole balance of forces on the world had changed dramatically. Stalinism had emerged, not weakened, but strengthened enormously. The Red Army had conquered half of Europe. It had mass prestige and a great following everywhere from workers, ordinary workers. But for the leaders of the Fourth International, oh no, Stalinism is very weak. It's not strong, it's very weak. So weak, they said, it could be overthrown by diplomatic pressure. They were clearly living on another planet. The balance of forces were against imperialism. They could not intervene as they did in 1918, 1919, due to the war weariness and the radicalization of the troops. That's why they couldn't intervene in China, for instance. In Eastern Europe, the Stalinists, using their position, set up people's democracies. Capitalism was hanging by a thread in these countries. Most of the bourgeoisie had run away when the Nazis had to withdraw because they were collaborators. And Ted Grant explained, yes, What exists there is the shadow of the bourgeoisie. But when the imperialists attempted to use martial aid, not only to prop up Western Europe, but to give substance to this shadow of the bourgeoisie, the Stalinists intervened to crush it. In 1948, you had the Prague events, the Czech events, which signaled throughout Eastern Europe the elimination of capitalism and the creation of Stalinist regimes. They leaned on the working class in order to expropriate very easily. This is in 1948, when the Fourth International had a world conference. They were meeting at this time. But they refused to recognize there was any overturn of property relations in Eastern Europe. Mandel argued, look, Stalinism, as we said, is counter-revolutionary. And they could not carry through a revolution. And if they had done it, then Stalinism must be revolutionary. So what's the point in the Fourth International? This is the logic of these people. Rather than recognize what had happened, they're on such a low political level, because Trotsky himself in 1939-40 explained that Stalinism, under certain circumstances, could carry through a revolution in a distorted fashion. So they said that Eastern Europe was capitalist. The only comrades who understood what was going on, identified it, was Ted Grant and the leaders of the Revolutionary Communist Party. So they started to make one mistake after another. Every time there was a major event, they got it wrong. In Yugoslavia, Tito had come to power independently. And there was a clash between Stalin and Tito in 1948. Ted explained this was a clash between two rival bureaucracies in reality. But the leaders of the Fourth International did a complete 180-degree somersault and said Yugoslavia was practically a healthy worker state. They declared their support for Tito, who in reality for them became an unconscious Trotskyist. They didn't explain that miraculously Yugoslavia changed from a capitalist country to a relatively healthy worker state. They didn't explain that. They issued two open letters to Tito, which were full of praise. So, God, a bit like the NATO letter to Trump. You know that one? And how Tito was going to help form a new international with them. There's completely uncritical support of Stalinism. Of course, you could defend the Yugoslavs against national oppression, it is true, of the Moscow bureaucracy, that's true. But they prettified the Tito regime, prettified it. And they organized work brigades in Britain, in France, in other countries. Build socialism, help build socialism in Yugoslavia. That was the Trotskyist movement. Incidentally, that was Lambert, by the way. He led one of these delegations, trade union delegations from France, and came back writing this glorious report about this worker state on the lines of the October Revolution and so on and so forth. It was a complete capitulation to Stalinism, let's be clear about it. And they all did it. Cannon, Pablo, Mandel, Frank, all of them. Healey organized brigades as well. Lambert, all these great theoreticians, all capitulated to Stalinism. Again, the only comrades who got things correct was the leadership of the RCP, Ted Grant in particular. Read his material, explaining this was a clash between two bureaucracies. Yes, it represents a crisis of Stalinism, but it's false to capitulate to Stalinism. They then later had an absurd position in relation to China. The regime in China of Chiang Kai-shek was rotten. Japan had invaded China to subjugate it. There's a war for national liberation, of course, and Mao's armies participated in that. But by the end of the war, by 1944, Japan had been expelled, and civil war opened up in China from 1944 to 1949. And the leaders of the Fourth International, again, got it completely wrong. They took an idea that Trotsky had raised tentatively, I think in 1938 or 39, given the history of China, which had a series of peasant wars and peasant uprisings, where the leaders of the peasants would normally betray the movement and fuse with elements in the town to organize a new dynasty. So the leaders of the Fourth International put forward the idea that Mao Zedong would inevitably capitulate to Chiang Kai-shek. And that was their line, basically. That Mao, yes, they would just capitulate, just like all the other peasant movements. Again, not seeing things concretely on the ground, not an abstract formula worked out a long time ago. Look at what's going on here and now. And Mao, yes, he was leading a peasant army, but the only way he could win support was carry out land reform, give land to the peasants. And that's what was happening. And he was gaining ground against Chiang Kai-shek. And these brilliant theoreticians of the Fourth International said, look, no, he's going to capitulate, he's going to capitulate. And I think it was Shachtman, wasn't it? I think everybody knows the joke, but it's worth saying again. For our audience outside. Shachtman, at least he had a sense of humor, at least. And said that, yes, Chiang Kai-shek wants to capitulate. So, I knew I'd get it wrong. I'm thinking to myself, Chiang Kai-shek, no, but Mao Zedong, capitulate to Chiang Kai-shek. The problem was, Mao couldn't catch Chiang Kai-shek because he was running away. And I always remember what Ted said then about when Mao's armies marched through and stopped at the Great Yangtze River. Chiang Kai-shek's army was on the other side of the river, and it was taking place at a time of our conference of the Fourth International, where the Chinese representatives were there, and they still argued that Mao was going to capitulate. He would not cross the Yangtze River. And of course, by the end of the Congress of the Fourth International, Mao had crossed the Yangtze River and kicked shit out of the forces of defeated them. So once again, the leaders completely out of tune, completely useless in relation to analyzing what was going on. And yet, if you compare the writings of Ted Grant at this time about China, they're absolutely incredible. He was able to explain the processes unfolding before they took place. In particular, I would invite you to read Ted Grant's reply to David James, written in January 1949. This is at the time, by the way, where Mao was publicly talking about if they come to power, which was likely, there was going to be 100 years of capitalism in China. And the leaders of the Fourth International believed him, of course, and everything in those terms. But Ted Grant explained, given the complete impasse of Chinese capitalism, reflected in the complete rottenness of the old Chiang Kai-shek regime, given the enormous model that stood behind them of Stalinism, of Russian Stalinism, and the inability of imperialism to intervene, they could not intervene with troops. Ted predicted before Mao got to power, he would get to power, and despite their intentions, they will be forced to carry through leaning on the peasant army to carry through the expropriation of Chinese capitalism. We said that the Chinese Revolution is the second greatest event in the whole of history, despite the fact it was the creation of a deformed worker state from the very origins. But Ted, even before Mao came to power, he said that Mao's regime would actually come into conflict with Stalin, which was a precursor of the Sino-Soviet dispute that took place much later. So this showed the superiority, yes, looking at the processes with a Marxist method of understanding. When Mao came to power, the leaders of the Fourth International declared that China was capitalist. And as far as I can see, they did not change their position until 1955. So they got everything wrong. The balance of forces, the strength of Stalinism, the economic recovery, Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, China, not much left. Incidentally, I would say that in relation to the perspectives of an economic recovery, well, Ted explained there is a recovery and there will be a boom taking place. He clearly did not think it was going to last as an upswing for 25 years. Could never anticipate that. But obviously this period, this post-war period, had given rise to enormous challenges, should we say. Well, yes, quite clearly, it was a very difficult period for Trotskyism, clearly. You know, the Stalinists were carrying out revolution in different parts of the world, in a deformed way, but nevertheless. But therefore, you needed clarity. You needed to educate the cadres of what exactly was happening. Otherwise, they'd be under the pressures of Stalinism, which they were. But the leaders of the Fourth, they weren't having any of it. They were just denying everything. You had this episode which Ted writes about in the program of the International, which every comrade should study, where in 1947, the comrades bumped into, or met at least, a man called Sam Gordon. And he was one of the leaders of the American section in particular, but it worked in Europe. And the comrades challenged him about the old perspective, that he needed a new one. And his reply was, no, Trotsky said in 1938, in 10 years, the Fourth International will be a dominant force on the planet. We got another year to go. I mean, that sums up, in a nutshell, the complete lunacy of these leaders. Of course, the Ted and the RCP leaders recognized that it was a difficult situation. The objective situation changed again, not in their favor. Not only were the Stalinists making big headway in Eastern Europe and in China, but the Reformists in power were actually carrying out their program. After all, the position of the Trotskyists was, you know, if Reformists come to power, given the crisis of capitalism, they would not be able to carry out their program. And that's why you need a revolutionary program to answer the problems of the working class. In Britain, for instance, we had a landslide Labour government elected in 1945, which for the first time in history, was actually carrying out its program. The basic industries were nationalized. You know, coal, steel, the railways. Whole series of industries, bankrupt industries, were nationalized. They created the National Health Service, which was a colossal gain. Above all, people could see things were getting a bit better than in the past. Compared to the 1930s, which is a horror for working people, reforms, wages, full employment. So this fact, the fact that reformists were implementing the program, gave a big problem for the Trotskyists. They were really on the defensive now. And they had to navigate the situation, explain, educate, and try and keep their forces together for when the situation changed. In fact, Ted Grant wrote a very good article analysing the difference between the 1929 Labour government and the 1945 Labour government. Where in 29 it was a crisis Labour government, and in 1945 they were delivering the goods. While this was all taking place, as you know, Jerry Healey was organising a faction within the RCP with the support of the leaders of the Fourth International. Healey just repeated word for word what the big brother was saying either in Paris or in New York, whichever it was. And again, it was nice, Ted always related this funny incident at the executive committee where Healey was invited along on some technical report he had to give, or some issue. And at that time, there was a big argument in the British, or by Healey in particular, that they should maintain the Russian troops in Europe. The position of the RCP was no, they should be withdrawn. They're playing a counter-revolutionary role there. But the Fourth International leaders had been silent. So the RCP wrote to Pablo and company, what is the position in relation to the Red Army troops? They got the reply, but they put it in the desk, because the reply was to confirm that that Red Army troops should be withdrawn against Healey's position. So when Healey was there, they got the letter out and said, oh yeah, this is the position of the IS, by the way. We're in favor of withdrawing the troops. And then Healey just looked in astonishment. Ted said he looked like the man who was embarrassed when he broke wind in company. And Healey just said, well, we got agreement then. In other words, he was even getting his directives, by letter, by telegram. He was just a parrot, just talk. Everything they said, he would repeat. He tried different ways of forming this faction, trying to find an issue on which to form this faction. And he picked on the issue of enterism, that the party should dissolve and enter the British Labour Party at that time. This is where an understanding of the concrete situation is important in relation to tactics. Healey's arguments was, look, the Labour Party is filled out, it's got hundreds of thousands of members, there's an active left wing, we should enter and galvanise the left. And the leaders, Ted and Haston, said, no, the conditions for entry into the Labour Party do not exist at the present time. In the 1930s, you had centrist currents developing in a pre-revolutionary situation where there was a big crystallization of a mass left wing, which wasn't the case in Britain at this time. Anyway, Healey managed to get about 20% of the vote in a conference. That's as much as he could get. I think, and the factional lines were tight. They were fixed. So the IS takes a decision. They support in Healey's policy of enterism, and they proposed splitting the RCP, allowing Healey to go into the Labour Party and be recognised as a section, and the rest of the RCP will remain outside and also be recognised, of course. Clearly, this was a manoeuvre, and it was condemned by the ranks of the RCP, but it was carried out towards the summer of 1947. And of course, this split led to a certain confusion, anger, but also a bit of demoralization. The RCP ranks was shown to be correct. The leadership was shown to be correct on all these points, while the Fourth International leaders were shown to be absolutely incorrect in all these problems. So as you can think about it, commoners are getting a bit demoralized, that these leaders have made a mess of it. Now they've split the RCP at a time when there was growing objective difficulties facing the party. So they were losing members in these years. And within a year, by the end of 1948, it was clear that Haston, who was the General Secretary, was becoming completely demoralized by all these things. He was sick and tired of the leadership of the International, and if in reality he was looking for a bit of a shortcut out of these difficulties, when there was no shortcut. And he raised the idea of entry into the Labour Party. It should be noted that Healey in the Labour Party adopted a policy of deep entrism. They set up a front organisation and a newspaper called Socialist Outlook, which was a left reformist paper with left reformist MPs like Bessie, you wouldn't know him, Bessie Braddock and all these other, so useless people. They were involved in this production with Healey. And Healey's position was build the left. The task of Trotskyists should be to paint themselves as left reformists in order to build the left wing in the Labour Party, which did not exist. So Healey wasn't building either. That's a fact. But in relation to the proposal of Haston about entry, Ted Grant was opposed to entry. The conditions did not exist for entry, therefore we should not go in. It's as simple as that. The only thing is, a debate took place in the party. I think there were three factions basically formed, and there wasn't a majority to enter. In fact, it was quite finely balanced, but there wasn't a majority. And Ted thought and hoped that he could keep the leadership of the RCP together, which they'd built over a period of 10 years. And rather than a heated clash with Haston, which he could have had, he decided to abstain on the basis of, under these difficult conditions that prevail, inside the Labour Party or outside the Labour Party wouldn't have made a fundamental difference in building the forces. It wasn't very fruitful inside, but it wasn't very fruitful outside. It's as simple as that. And anyway, Ted understood that in the longer term, on the basis of capitalist crisis, which would also affect the Labour Party, entrism would be posed at a certain later stage. Anyway, a conference was called in June 1949, and a resolution was passed to dissolve the RCP and call in all members to join the Labour Party. When the comrades then raised the idea, okay, we can set up our own organisation in the Labour Party, the IS intervened and said, hang on a minute, you must negotiate with Jerry Healey. And Healey demanded that if we were right, because we're in here, you came in on our terms, you'll join us in the party, in our organisation. There will be no political debate on this question for 6 months, in which time they would have a Congress at the end of the six months to decide what to do. Of course, most people didn't get to the 6 months. They were expelled by Jerry Healey. Tony Cliff was expelled for raising the question of state capitalism. Jimmy Dean was expelled. Ted Grant was expelled. Leyer were expelled. And others just left in despair, demoralized. The Fourth International leaders had succeeded. They destroyed the RCP and destroyed the leadership of the RCP. All for the sake of what? Of prestige politics. They could not be shown to be wrong. And the RCP leaders, and Ted Grant in particular, were showing up very well to be wrong. Of course, in 1950 then, Ted was a member of the IEC. He was expelled on a resolution put forward by Ernest Mandel for the crime of disparaging Trotskyism, I think. Obviously, at this point, Ted managed to gather around him a group of about 30 comrades. His first task is to write an open letter to the British section of the Fourth International, which is worth all comrades reading, because it explains point by point the reasons for the degeneration of the Fourth International, and that basically they had no alternative but to muster the forces. In 1953, there was a split then that took place in the ranks of the Fourth International, as it was. James Cannon had woken up to the threat of Pabloism in the Fourth International, together with other sections, saying that Pablo was the bearer of Stalinism. But in reality, up until this point, there were no political differences between these people, including Pablo. They were all pro-Stalinist. As we said at the time, that Cannon, Pablo, Healey, Frank, Mandel, they attacked Pabloism. No, the other, that was Cannon. Cannon attacked it as Pabloism. But they were the original Pabloites. They were the original ones. The split wasn't about politics, it was about who should put their nose into other people's affairs, actually. Pablo had been in touch with a faction in the American SWP, the Cochranites. And Cannon wanted to tell him to keep his nose out of the American section. So this split in reality was to keep those who interfered in the American section out, and for Healey, who was Cannon supporter, to be their representative in Europe in reality. Eventually, in the 1950s, it dawned on these people, that is Pierre Frank, Cannon, Mandel and so on, that something was happening in capitalism. They finally recognized that there was not just a boom, an upswing was taking place, but instead of a Marxist analysis towards what was happening, they capitulated to bourgeois Keynesianism. Yeah, Tony Cliff came forward with the idea, the stability because of the arms economy. It's going to be a permanent arms economy has caused this upswing. Whereas Mandel suggested it was state spending that was causing the boom to continue. In other words, this is classic Keynesianism. In other words, pump prime the economy. Deficit financing by any other means. So they capitulated to their immediate environment, bourgeois environment. Whereas Ted explained once again what was happening by a concrete analysis of the facts. He explained that this upswing consisted of a massive development of the productive forces, yes. He said that capitalism, given the factors developed after the Second World War, allowed capitalism to partially and for a temporary period of time to overcome their contradictions. It was, above all, the role of American imperialism opened up the world market. Tariffs were abolished. The whole world market was opened up. So you had a spiraling of world trade and the world economy. And this is the material basis for the strengthening of reformism in these years. Even the Tory Prime Minister, Macmillan, said, in 1959, you've never had it so good. And for very many people, that was true. Mass unemployment had gone. People could get houses. You could get jobs. You could leave your job on the Friday, get another job on the Monday. Living standards were rising. And as a result, illusions in capitalism and reformism were strengthened for a whole period. But Ted explained in Will There Be a Slump, the factors that are causing the boom will turn into their opposites and we'll have an enormous crisis of capitalism, which in turn would transform consciousness and open up the way for revolutionary ideas. And our task was to prepare for that future. Of course, you have those people who denied it. Then Healey was predicting world slump and world war and fascism every year. Right up to well, he's dead now, but right up to the recent period. Lambert just refused to recognize reality. Said, well, the productive forces have not grown since 1938 or 1914, whatever you want to call it. In other words, deny reality when the working class knew full well what was happening. So we can see where a false method can lead. A false method can lead to the destruction of the movement. Fortunately, it was Ted who preserved those ideas, that unbroken thread, the results of which we have in this international today. Ted's role was indispensable for laying down the real, genuine foundations of Marxism, of Trotskyism. And therefore, we appeal to all comrades, yes, to study, to learn, to prepare yourselves for what is coming. We have to train ourselves in that method, the Marxist method of dialectical materialism, and have an ability to apply it. We must take on board what Trotsky said in the 1930s. We must raise the theoretical level of all members in preparation for the revolution in the future. And comrades, part and parcel of that is an understanding of where we come from, our heritage, to learn the lessons of the degeneration of the Fourth International. So that this international can be built on solid foundations. And while the Fourth International, as it was, does not exist, it only now exists in this organization, in the ideas that we represent. Comrades, forward to the building of the Revolutionary International Communist Organization.